Oh, and we are live with our 60th episode of Absolute AppSec. We jettisoned Ken once again for this week. I'm your host today at Seth Law, at Seth Law on Twitter. At CK Tricky is off. I don't know what. He had some excuse, and I don't know what it is. So in his place, I have asked Stefan Edwards at lojikil on Twitter to join us once again. And he's going to turn me into a nihilist about something else because, I just gave up on security unit testing and testing in general after we got done with our last conversation. Before we get into it, there was, I think the only announcement is that the next couple of weeks, I think we may have a couple of streamed episodes coming from AppSec Global in Tel Aviv. Ken and I will be teaching our secure code review course there. And watch for other opportunities. We got a couple other conferences in the works where we're going to be teaching that course as well. So, but the biggest one is that. And then, DEF CON, I'll be there. I'm trying to think if there's really anything else. AppSec Day in Melbourne, that's in Australia. Obviously, Melbourne, that's in October. We'll be doing the code review course down there, but there's going to be a couple other places in the States that we do it. But we can just kind of drop that for this week now. And Stefan, we can get into it. How are things going, man? I appreciate you coming on once again to help me out.
It's always fun to come on here and chat, security nothingness with you.
Security nothingness. What are you saying about our security? Like our
security and nothingness.
Knowledge of security and
it's like Sartre writ large, but for security.
But for security, yes, it is, right?
No, I mean, I think you and I wanted to chat the Huawei thing that I was quoted in by Lorenzo for Vice.
Yes.
And then we wanted to chat like programming languages or whatever else came up. Probably we'll get like totally distracted by the lack of Android security entirely. But
yes, and I know we both have experiences with that, and definitely let's start with Huawei. For those listeners that may or may not know, I'm pretty sure everyone does at this point. Huawei's under sanctions from the U.S. government. Because they apparently steal a lot of intellectual property from all of our technology companies. And because of this, Google, it's in flux right now, but Google did suspend their license for Android, which means that Huawei shouldn't be able to access the Android services, like any of the Google services, using from any of their Android devices, whether that's phones or tablets or anything that wouldn't support them with security updates or anything else moving forward on those devices. So there's millions of Android phones out there that are Huawei branded or that are built by Huawei. So of course everyone's losing their collective shit over it because it's a pretty huge kind of security risk when it comes down to it. First of all, let's talk a little bit about the article, on Vice, what was their take on it? What was your quote? I mean, I can bring up the quote here. I've got it somewhere, but I'll find the link and we'll post it.
No, so Lorenzo asked in chat if anyone had any strong opinions or feelings on Android, and I mean, I'm apparently known for having strong opinions about things. And so,
really, I didn't know this about you.
I know it's such a strange thing to me personally, but Lorenzo and I were just chatting about it, and it's like, look, I understand what people are concerned about. I think AOSP trails Android proper. Google has agreements where you basically pay for access to certain patches and things like that. So I get it. There's definitely security risk, but in terms of Huawei itself, in China, App Store is not the major app supplier atop Android. I think it's in 5th position in China itself. So Huawei's home base is not truly impacted by this. And then outside of China, it's mostly Europe that uses Huawei. They have the largest penetration for lower end devices in Europe itself. So, I mean, is there a security risk of it? Like there's a security risk, but it's the same security risk as Samsung, which is what I was quoted about. That Samsung does a bunch of dumb shit to their Android install base, and they have to backport patches and stuff like that. And there's no real difference here for Huawei either. They'll be tracking AOSP, which is the Android open source project or platform. I think project.
Yeah.
They'll be backtracking things on AOSP, and they'll have to like keep up to date with AOSP. But in terms of the actual security for people, I think the risk is really, honestly, negligible.
Yeah. I go back and forth on it, right? Like Huawei is a huge company, right? Like, in one of my past lives, I actually, visited their campus in Shenzhen, and kind of saw the whole operation. They got a lot of smart engineers and smart people that are over there doing things. Like I could go into, like kind of some of their basic development practices and what I was and wasn't impressed with. But it's like any big company, like they could probably turn around and build their own version of Android if they had to, or they could replicate security events. I mean, heck, I know that they have ties with, and they do a lot of security research there in China that they're actually pulling for mobile devices. And so it wouldn't surprise me if if it would spur their security, in a different direction or make them more secure than it is the base level Android version, right? Like it would almost fork. And then you brought up another good point about Fuchsia, right?
Yeah, they're already testing out Fuchsia. So for anyone who doesn't know, Google has a second. So there's basically 3 operating systems in Google right now. You have Android, which everyone is familiar with, and Chrome OS, which everyone is familiar with. But they're experimenting with another operating system, which is released under an MIT license, maybe ISC licensed microkernel. The microkernel is bespoke. It's completely different. It's based off of Little Kernel, LLK, and it uses Flutter and Dart in the core, has a very different operating system feel, and Google is experimenting with Fuchsia. Now, your commentary about Fuchsia aside, like some people view that as just like an engineering retainership project. Some people review it as like the future of operating systems. But whatever you feel about it, going forward, Huawei is experimenting. They are releasing a phone on top Fuchsia already. So.
Yeah, I was just digging through I linked the Wikipedia article on Fuchsia, and that's always it as well, right? Is they've got all the, you've got your engineering project, your internal, your skunkworks stuff that's going on, but that feels very much like Android did, 10 years ago before they released it, right? They had all of these like development phones. Everybody was excited about it. The first couple that came out were complete crap. And then, they figured out how to work with it, right? And, the advantages to dropping something like the Linux kernel. And there's just so much that's going into it that I fully foresee something like Fuchsia either taking over the internals and maybe they keep the top. I know that Huawei could figure that out, right?
For sure.
Sure. They have their own mobile operating systems as well. That they could probably drop Android tomorrow if they had to. It was just the easiest way for them to be globally supported and to push those devices out. So we've got that whole aspect of the Huawei fight, I guess, that's going on now that, seems fairly ridiculous. How much have you actually dealt with the company Huawei in the past? Have you looked at the routers or anything else that they do outside of the mobile devices?
I Glomar response that. I have looked at some of their other devices. I've also looked at some of their security research too. I mean, they're no worse than any other firm when they were starting up, right? Cisco had Cisco literally just last week had a default SSH key bug.
Yeah.
The year of our Lord 2019, they are still dealing with the same default credentials thing. So, is Huawei better or worse? They just are, right? Now that's ignoring any claims of espionage, industrial or otherwise. But in terms of their security practices, like they could be better. Of course, there are certain things that they could do a lot more of, but I don't think it's as bad as people make it out to be. I think it's more the political system is, they're just on the unfavorable side of it right now.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Like, I mean, it's unfortunate, right? Like knowing the guys that I've talked to over there and I've worked with that are at Huawei. I mean, it's like any security engineer that you would talk to that worked at Google or some other place or developer. Right. Yeah. There is some backing there, that can be disputed, whether it's, the Chinese government or whatever that's going on with the corporate structure. But the company itself is just another technology company. That's how you would view it if you were not in the U.S. and we were not in this like weird trade fight with the Chinese and with Huawei. Currently, I don't know. I feel like any of the large technology companies have their skeletons. I mean, you mentioned Cisco, but there's a lot of questions about how Cisco actually got founded and the designs that they used and where they actually came up with their initial router architecture. And, if they just full on just stole those directly from, what was it, Stanford, right? I believe.
Well, so it's like Google is one of the few companies that has had a branded National Reconnaissance Office launch. If I recall correctly, part of the issue is that Chinese law requires that if you have 3 or more party members in your company, you have to have party representation within the company itself. So it's just a very different system. And would I be surprised if Huawei is spying? Like, absolutely not. But it's just, I don't know what they themselves could necessarily do about that, given the environment that they operate in.
Yeah.
It's hard to hold them to our standards for that sort of stuff.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, and it's like that in any country that you go to, I mean, Siemens or anybody that's coming out of Europe. Yes, it looks a lot like a US company. But it's like they have different regulations that they have to follow. You want to build a company in a different country, you have to follow the laws that you're currently, you just have to follow the laws of that country. Right?
What are they going to do about it? I mean, it's now, having said that, if they are actually spying, like, clearly they should be, I'm okay. I understand why people are mistrustful, but I also feel like this is a little bit of a geopolitical thing that's not necessarily to do with the tech per se.
Yeah.
I mean, they've had doozies. Don't get me wrong. They've had some pretty bad vulnerabilities before, but.
Yeah, but again, so has Cisco, so has IBM, so has everybody, like so has Microsoft. It's not like they're special in that case. So all right. So does that take us to more Android security? Do you want to talk more there?
I mean, we can always talk Android security, right? Like, I'm never down. I'm actually just looking at the CVE details right now because I was curious about that. So there's a bunch of they have quite a few over 7 vulnerabilities for IPS modules, for their IBMC modules have a few, but so is Dell, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they're no different than. I was just curious, like, how big of a doozy are they? Like, I do wonder how much of this is jingoism mixed with the current political climate, and how much of this is actual, actual issues with Huawei itself,
Oh yeah. It's just been, it's interesting to watch, right?
Sure.
I remember when I was working with them, I would mention that name and no one had any idea who Huawei was. And I'm like, it's like the second largest, technology company that exists. It's just that the U.S. has always had it out for them, so we don't hear anything about them. And I'm like, they have phones that are as good or if not better than the Android phone that you've got in your pocket. And just because you don't know who they are doesn't mean they're not a force to be reckoned with. And right. I think that's what's happening is their technology is getting pushed. We talk about the cell stuff because that's probably the biggest issue that, or that's the sticking point that the government has, is because, hey, Huawei builds the routers for cell networks, and especially the next generation ones. Like if you start talking 5G, they're the ones that are available and ready to go right now, and are being deployed across the world. And the U.S. government doesn't trust the company because it's built in China. That's basically what it boils down to.
Which is understandable, right? Like, it's why we have U.S. sourcing for products when you work in government. But, how much of that is just precaution based on a national security threat profile versus a consumer profile threat is a different discussion,
Yeah.
And Android security is terrible anyway. So
yeah, well, so that's just it. We always talk about threat models, right? We're doing application threat models, or we're looking at a system and we're doing a threat model. And I always hit that. Hey, my threat model does not include nation state actors, right? If I worry about that, I'm going to put on a tinfoil hat and go live in a cabin somewhere, because there's just not any getting around it. And that doesn't include just other nation states. That includes the state that you live in, right? And so I feel like we're kind of we overblow the fact that, hey, guess what? Somebody could jump on that cell network and they could do X, Y, and Z. And if they build a backdoor into it, they could decrypt the traffic. And I'm like, yes, but your application is also using public-private, key cryptography. And if the government's going to target you, they're going to find a way, is really what it boils down to.
Well, does 5G still use A5, the A5 cipher? I'd have to look that up.
I would have to look it up. I don't know off the top of my head.
I mean, because I know there are problems with A2 and A5, and I'm not a cryptographer. I know FIPS 140 and that sort of stuff, but there are serious concerns with the cryptographic strength of A2 and A5, which are the streaming ciphers that are used for cellular network connections. So, did they build anything worse than what we thought was okay before? I mean, do they export the keys? Or the keys held in escrow? That could happen with a cell tower anyway. It could be an Italian one. You wouldn't know.
Yeah. I mean, as long as your communication's going through, are you really that worried about it? I mean, and I feel like we've got other technologies that are built on top of that network topology that give us a greater assurance that security happens. I mean, you look at Whisper systems, you look at the Signal, and some of the other apps that run on top of there. If you're really worried about your communications, that's probably the path that you should be going, rather than just trusting that AT&T or whoever has got your back, right?
Well, yeah, for sure. I mean, AT&T, all of those, they're beholden to the baseband processor that they're using anyway, which has pretty direct access to memory. They're moving away from that now, but for a long time it had direct DMA access to memory. It was problematic, and any flaw in baseband would mean basically a complete access to your phone itself. Phones are actually split. There's two operating systems: the one that you interact with, and then the baseband operating system, which has all of the cellular network connectivity and everything. So, it's just, I think this is, China's really hot in the news right now. Everything sounds scary about China. We're having these these tariff wars, and then Huawei is a good face for this sort of for exposing the problem, and it's a real problem. It's exposing a problem, but it's also, Huawei is unfortunately the target thereof.
Yeah. And I don't know how much of you talk about IP theft and product creation. And I know, from my experience, my son does Chinese immersion, right? I don't know if you knew that. He's been, for a couple of, for the past 10 years, he's been half his day is all Chinese. And, so I took him with us when we did that trip, when I went to the Huawei headquarters, and the culture over there is different as well, right? The whole idea of intellectual property is just not something that they necessarily respect, right? It's about being like people are held up for being more clever, right?
Right.
So, hey, if someone invents something, but they're not clever enough to figure out how to process that correctly or how to do it so they can make a lot of money, they laud the person that can figure that out and can actually grow the company and make all of the money, right? Like it's there's just kind of a different cultural perspective to how things are created and who owns what, right? There's not the whole protectionism that we give to ideas and the products over here to, hey, if you're first there, you get the copyright, which means you're the only person that can produce that product for the first however many years. And yeah, so it's like, I think that plays a lot into what we see and what we fear from them. Is they do a good job of copying processes. They do a good job of engineering. They've trained their people, and like, it's a different way of viewing the world, I guess, is what I was trying to get at.
Well, I mean, industrial espionage is much more common in Europe, right? Like France, Israel, etc. And Israel's obviously in the Middle East, but I'm lumping it in there. They're generally much more active in industrial espionage than we are in the U.S. And it's different cultural perspective. I think we should protect against it, and I think we should review it. But like, is it any worse than anything else? Not really. I mean, how much do you trust anything from France or Italy, right?
Yeah.
They have active security apparatuses. Like,
Yep. Yeah. I mean, it does. Like, it always goes back to what's your internal threat model, right? Like, what is your risk tolerance? Hey, are you willing to save a couple of bucks if you get something that's it does the job, but maybe it's not the most secure, or maybe it's not the highest quality. Hey, that's that's your decision to make. Anyway,
well, people don't want. Yeah, you don't want to pay for it. Like, they want the benefits of using Chinese manufacturing costs, but not the risks that come with it. Like,
yeah,
it's the same thing with Android, right? Like, it's not. Yes, you can get a very cheap Android device, but they're not keeping up with the latest specs or anything like that. Like,
yeah.
Good luck updating an Android device, some random one.
Oh man, yeah. Especially okay, so let's talk about that a little bit, right? Like Android and just in general, kind of the splintering of Android. I mean, that's one of the things that we always kind of look at is from an iOS perspective. Apple comes out with a new release, and every phone that supports it pretty much gets the update, and it's rolled out within like a couple of weeks. You're talking the majority of the phones have that new iOS version. Android is just such a mixed bag when it comes to that. And I mean, it's mainly because of those, like the little phones that you're talking about, right? Like the little feature phones or whatever that are sold for, 20, 30 bucks. Guess what? They're never going to get the latest and greatest version of Android.
Well, it's like you can go down to the drugstore right now and buy one of those $50 tablets or netbooks or whatever, and it'll have Android on it, and it might even have a side-loaded app store.
Yeah.
But good luck updating that to anything past Android 6.
Oh yeah, yeah, because it just they won't support it, or like the company's gone out of business, whatever it is.
Yeah, I mean, Android itself is just I think the split is that Android focuses on software security and iOS focuses on hardware security, and really using like even the enclave, right? Like keychain in iOS. Like, how long did we have all of these janky solutions to fix things on Android that should have just been like, store this in the keychain and never think about this again?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I mean, I go back to some of the recent assessments that I've done on Android, right? Comparing iOS to Android, and it's still an issue. Like the way that they want to use that key store is, oh, well, we're just gonna, you generate a key and you pull that out of there and then you use it to encrypt things, right? And I'm like, okay, that's not quite the same, right? Like you're not storing my secrets in a trusted enclave or like the trusted execution or whatever they call it, right? The TEE. You're giving me a key to encrypt things, which is great, but it's still not quite to that same level of, hey, it's always tied to the device and to my account, and I can't pull that out unless I like prove my user presence and all that kind of stuff.
Well, the keys are problematic too, because very often clients have no idea what to do with them. So I've had clients that just like write them back to the file system, right?
So they actually, yeah.
Like it defeats the whole purpose of having a key, but unfortunately that's still where we're at with Android, And like I had a client just the other day that was running into problem with the advanced keychain. I mean, the advanced key store, and they were trying to do some stuff and they were running into some problems with it. And it was just like, it's 2019 and I still can't recommend to a client to use that without there being some sort of like, hit performance or usability wise, you know? It's just,
yeah. Well, I can't figure out why that is, right? Like, so you're saying that it's because Android is focused more on software security. So like at the app level, is that what you're saying, as opposed to the hardware level?
Well, no, I mean, they can't say, or they don't say anyway, they never say, in order to put out an Android phone, you have to have a TEE, you have to have SGX, you have to have something like that, some HSM built into this thing. It's always like, oh, we can run Android on anything, which is like, technically you can make that secure, but actually making that secure is problematic. And we see it with all of the software issues on Android continuously. It's like the Pixel or the Nexus. Like I have a Nexus here that I use for testing, right? An old one, so it's no longer supported either. But they have those flagship ones, which are of the quality of iPhones, but those are not the ones that most people have. Like, ask your normal friends who have Androids if any of them have even heard of the Google Pixel or Nexus line or anything like that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I'm most likely they'll respond with, well, I have like a Samsung, right?
Right.
That's what they equate with Android.
Right.
It really is.
Yeah. And unfortunately, like Samsung has Knox now, and they've done a lot of work at making like a secure environment, but they still have issues all the time. I mean, it's just Android does not focus on consistency. It focuses on being able to run on every single goddamn device under the sun, kind of like Linux and NetBSD.
Yeah.
Like you could put Android on some stupid ARM-based toaster, and it would make sense and it would work fine.
Well, it has to work on the refrigerator, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
Well, and that's actually an execution profile for Android, right? Like all the Samsung refrigerators are actually Android refrigerators, which is horrifying and mind-blowing at the same time. But it's a bad thing. Did you lose me for a second there? Oh well.
Yeah, I lost you for a second.
It's bad. Oh well.
Yeah. No, I was just gonna say like that was it. Like I recently we were looking at refrigerators, and the salesman was trying to sell me on the Android, like the Samsung Android, and I'm like, man, you have no idea what's going on with this thing, right? Like,
I do.
I know.
I know what's going on here behind the scenes, and I want nothing to do with it. You know what I will say, and maybe this gets us into our next topic. I will say it's interesting that Android is moving towards Kotlin.
Yeah.
For their programming. There's some interesting tooling and some interesting work being done in the Kotlin space itself.
Okay.
So.
Maybe we can move to that, right? I mean, that happened, within the last couple of years, right? Mm-hmm. That Kotlin really took over. So, I mean, first of all, let's roll back a little bit and like actually talk about what Kotlin is versus what's currently been used. Right. In the past, Android was always Java based, which was a huge complaint, right? Like, you want to know why those first Android phones ran so slow? It's because they were running Java. It's right. It's write once, run anywhere is the whole mantra behind Java. The fact that it's not compiled, so you can take that language or you can take that pseudo compiled object and actually run it on any place that a Java engine exists.
Right.
So that was the idea behind Java. So what is Kotlin in relationship to that?
Kotlin is a stripped down language similar to Scala, which I know is a 4-letter word for you, Seth. But it has a syntax reminiscent of issues or ideas from Scala, things from more traditional like Pascal dialects, things like C#. Like it has a never null operator similar to C#.
Okay.
So you can, and then it also has nullable types, those sorts of things. So it's an interesting direction. I think it's by JetBrains, the IDE maker, believe it or not, which is weird. You wouldn't have expected them to come out with a programming language that was so successful across other things, but like it's been an interesting move, and it's been an interesting shift to see things. Are people trolling in chat?
Yeah, of course, you know.
Should I pull up chat on my phone to see what's going on?
No, you're okay. You're okay.
But I mean, like honestly, the things that are going on, or the direction that they're moving with Kotlin is an interesting one, right? Kotlin has native support, so it can compile to actual like x86 binaries. It can compile to JVM. It can compile to JS, things like that. So it's an interesting language with interesting semantics. So
cool. And have you been seeing like, so in your your professional career, as you're looking at different devices and things like that, from an Android perspective, are you seeing developers move to Kotlin? I know that's the direction that Java wants, or not Java, that Google wants to push. But have you been seeing more and more Kotlin come around?
Well, so it's interesting. I've seen Kotlin on the server side too.
Okay.
I've seen folks using Kotlin instead of Java itself on the server side for things, and they're using like NIO or whatever directly from Kotlin and not touching any Java whatsoever. And then their Android app is also written in Kotlin. It's similar to IBM moving a lot of their stuff to Swift, which also has a similar syntax to Kotlin. So not all of it, obviously, but large portions of it are not totally unfamiliar. And so as these companies move towards newer languages and move towards newer platforms, like, I am seeing customers shift. Now, obviously, where I work predicates that a lot more customers come to us with weirder languages, of course, or newer things. But, there is quite a bit of Kotlin out there for folks to see. So
yeah. I mean, it seems to be fairly stable from that. From that perspective. I don't think Android would be pushing developers that direction if it wasn't.
Well, I mean, JetBrains uses it quite heavily themselves, right? Like they were dogfooding Kotlin before they released it to everyone for a lot of things. So it's by a company that at least has quite a bit of Java experience and understands how to tune things for the JVM, right? Very, very heavy Java shop. So, did you lose me?
Yeah, you just paused for a second. So, I mean, they were a heavy Java shop. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, they're in and out. They're doing quite a bit of things, but I do think that this push towards better languages and better tooling will help a lot more than another static analyzer, another other tooling integration like that.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to actually see how that happens. So, I mean, because we've seen that shift in the mobile space, right? It seems that that's where it started. Is that Apple decided they didn't want to use iOS, or they didn't want to use Objective-C anymore. So they came out with Swift, and they've been pushing that pretty heavily. And then Android on the flip side said, all right, well, we'll see you, and we'll switch to Kotlin as well.
Right.
Are there other industries that you're seeing that are, making similar changes? From, hey, we've got these old languages that have been out there forever, right? Like, when I get into the enterprise, I still see a lot of .NET and Java, and, we do run into C and C++ here and there. But it's all those kind of traditional languages. There is some newer, Node.js and other things like that. But realistically, I run into the enterprises and I don't see a lot of Go or even Python or anything like that. It's all of the old .NET and Java. That's what they still depend on. So
Mhm.
where are you seeing programming languages go in that case? Are we moving to, Node and JavaScript, or
I hope
are
not.
there other places? Yeah, you hope not. I mean, I think we could all agree with that. We don't want to move that direction, but it is still out there. So.
I mean, we see a lot of TypeScript come in, even atop Node, which I'm much happier about, right? Like you have types, people actually understand what they're using, what they're sending around to one another. TypeScript is a much better programming language for that space than JavaScript itself. We're seeing some F# come in.
Okay.
In shops. Microsoft is using it heavily for modeling and whatnot. It's replacing OCaml and Coq for a lot of modeling. Coq is COQ for all of the perverts listening and trying to troll me. It's a modeling language that is used for extracting programs from specifications. So we're seeing F# and F* take over those sorts of things. There's Stainless for Scala, which is used a lot. So I primarily work in infrastructure, in blockchain, and then in like mobile IoT sorts of things. I don't work really on the web. I work much more in the infrastructure side of code, and we are seeing quite a bit of Go. We're seeing things proven out in Rust, so Rust plus proofs and things like that. We're seeing a lot of movement towards that.
Okay. So. Yeah, it's definitely a different use case, right?
Mm-hmm.
The space that you're playing in, speed and being able to compile things, I totally understand why Go is taking off. From like it seems like the old C programmers and C++ programmers have pushed more that direction, as opposed to pushing into an interpreted language like a Python or a Perl or any of the others, because they do want that like. Like you're running infrastructure, it comes down to how fast can I move X, this packet from point A to point B.
Mm-hmm.
If it takes me 200 milliseconds longer, I can't sell my product, right?
Well, I mean, we're also having languages that can compete with C or C++ at least, but have much nicer semantics. Like no matter what you say about Go, it does have things like maps and expandable lists and things like that built in that are relatively performant.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's doing a lot of the heavy lifting that if you wanted to get the speed out of C++, you'd have to like futz with an allocator and futz with all like smart pointers and all this sort of stuff. Whereas with Go, for the average developer, it's going to get you much closer to what you would want to be performance-wise. So like, is it my favorite? No. But, I mean, I would prefer that we don't even have Turing complete languages for most of these things, like in expressivity. Like I think most developers don't even need to have Turing completeness.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go there then, right? Like, okay, for those listeners that aren't that didn't do CS in college, right? Let's talk about what being Turing complete means.
Well, so without getting too theoretical and without talking about like, all of the different like mathematical models and things like that, Turing completeness is basically, can you execute an arbitrary program on a Turing machine, right?
Okay.
And there's all different like universal Turing machines and things like this, and there's various different steps up and down, right? But effectively, general purpose programming languages are Turing complete. And because of that, you can't prove that they terminate. You have some computability theorems like Gödel's completeness theorem, second completeness theorem, and Rice's computability theorem, which basically limit what you can do to prove out if those programs can terminate. So the interesting thing is that, I've joked about this online, but like Solidity for EVM, for Ethereum, you can say how much money you're willing to burn on a calculation. So when you want to simulate your program, you can simulate it as if it had that much time to complete. And if it doesn't complete that, you know that it terminates because you literally stop burning money on this program. So it sounds weird, but you can actually do more things with Solidity in terms of testing because you can prove that it completes, and you can prove that there's certain aspects of the program will never be hit because of how, like, the semantics of it. So
yeah, and I know we've had this discussion on Turing completeness before, right? As far as okay, so from a theoretical perspective, all of the computer scientists that are out there, and everybody that's designing language, that seems to be their like gold standard. Right? This is what I'm building my language towards, even though. So if I understand what you're saying, it doesn't really matter to most people or most developers, right?
Well, so think about it this way, right? I suspect, I have a theory that most developers, if you took away the ability to do complete, like to be a Turing machine, they would A, not know what the fuck you're talking about, and B, would probably benefit from the fact that the compiler can give them much more accurate representations of what they thought they were doing.
Yeah.
So you have languages like F star, right? F star has integers, but then it also has total integers. And you can prove totality is another computability subject. We don't have to get into it right now. But because you have that level of expression, one above, and you can reduce the expressivity of the language, you can prove out more of what your program is doing in a smaller amount of space than in a general purpose programming language.
Okay.
So I think most programmers would actually benefit. And there was an experiment, Alex Infosec. I can send you the link. But basically, he wrote a programming language called Crema, and this was an experiment to make a sub-Turing complete programming language for normal people. So no like ML stuff, no crazy like type system, anything like this. It just looks like a JavaScript or a Java or something like that, And it was an experiment to see what do we actually get when we give people a sub-Turing programming language, and it was extremely interesting.
Yeah. So, let's pull that link up. I'd like to.
Do you have it, or?
I'm trying. That's what I'm trying to figure out. You said it's Alex Infosec.
It's so GitHub.com infosec. I'll just paste it into our chat right here. I was just looking at the tests there. But basically, I mean, when you have these sorts of sub-Turing completeness languages, like you can prove out more of the language. And I suspect that if you came up with something friendly enough that gave people actual access to what they need to do, which is, for most developers, it's like retrieve a bunch of crap from the database, do a bunch of crap to it, and then display all that crap back to the user, right?
Yeah.
That's all they care about. They really don't give a crap if they can do like an infinite for loop. In fact, they probably would prefer if they could never get themselves into that state. And with sub-Turing languages, you can prove that, hey, you actually did not screw this up. You did exactly what you thought you could do. I mean, in the blockchain space, we see this. There's a programming language called Obsidian. Obsidian was a research language that was released to replace Solidity. Now, Solidity is not exactly a general purpose language, but given infinite gas, it is Turing complete.
Okay.
So what the Obsidian folks did was they realized 90% of all Solidity programs are, I receive something, I process something, I send out something else. And I need to be in this state to do this thing, and I need to be in this state to do this other thing. And that's all I want to do. And so Obsidian actually codified all of those rules and made it so that you can never you can prove that I'm never accidentally in a state like over here that was not what I wanted to be doing.
Yeah.
And they did that by making it sub-Turing. And it's, there are people experimenting with it right now, but I think in general purpose stuff, that's the general direction. Like, what mobile application needs to actually be fully computable? Games, maybe? Right?
Yeah.
Maybe?
Yeah. Maybe. Yeah.
Maybe. Yeah, we're not even sure. Because games, you could be complete over the subset of the screen, let's say.
Yeah. But everywhere,
you just have a bunch of actors, and I mean that in the computability theory sense, where you have an actor that accepts a message and then processes it and sends it back. like you don't need to be Turing complete. And I suspect most developers would be better off for having themselves handcuffed to the bed.
Yeah. Well, like we always talk about that, right? Like a lot of the security problems that we see that exist. I mean, you go back to the C days, right? And like it's all because we're giving them too much power to do things that they don't understand, right? It's like they're trying to accomplish a task, like you're saying, and we're saying, hey, but you have to remember like where your memory pointers go, and your buffer. You need to allocate that memory, like, and so, and it seems that we get more secure the less flexible we make the language, and the more like codified that we do things, right? I mean, even in the web space, I see that, right? Like you see Rails and some of those others, kind of like strongly typed frameworks. As far as we do this in this one way, it's very easy for me to tell when you don't do it that way, and we can actually give you some feedback about why you shouldn't do it, right?
Well, it's interesting. Rails now has sorbet, which is a gradual type checker for Ruby. I just posted it in there. Sorbet is super interesting to see where they're moving with that, and it's similar to like where MyPy and PyWrite are moving. Microsoft just released PyWrite, which is super interesting in and of itself, which is basically a type checker for Python. But when you're looking at the directions of things, like people do better when you give them guide rails, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the argument always comes down with like, oh, there's this one guy I know that can program perfectly safe C every time he looks at it, and he knows all the undefined behavior in his program, or she knows all the undefined behavior in their program. And you're like, maybe that person is not me, by the way. I've been programming in C for like 24 years, and that person is not me. I cannot look at a program and tell what is UB or not. I mean, I can kind of, but I also don't care. I want the compiler to fix it for me. And it's so problematic. It's just, we shouldn't be at this place in 2019. Null was a hack that Tony Hoare added to a language in order to get around an optimization issue that he was looking at. Right?
Yeah.
and we're still, and like Tony Hoare admitted that was his like billion and or $1 trillion mistake, right? Like,
yeah. Yeah. But you understand why, because it ends up being so useful that developers gravitate towards it to solve a problem that probably wasn't intended to be solved for, like using that using that object, using that concept, and yet, hey, that's where we're at, right? That's realistically what happens.
Yeah, I mean, developers really don't understand what they're doing most of the time, right? Like they want to they understand their business domain. That's what they understand. They don't necessarily understand the entire suite of like security attacks and things like that against an application. They don't even necessarily understand the entire framework that they're using. So give them minimal amount that you can to help save them,
Yeah.
Save them from themselves.
Yeah. Well, and that that concept is not, I mean, it's not new, right? Like for sure, that's what we've been trying to do for years and years. The way that we design languages, that how they're intended to be used, and like even Kotlin and Swift. If we go back to that initial discussion, that seems to be the direction we're going. When we had Manico on, that's what we talked about was, hey, like, why don't we have like this one true framework that takes care of all the security problems and just saves the developers from themselves? There's always going to be people that want to break out of it. There's always people that are going to, think that they're the special case. And you can give people an avenue to do that without affecting the security of like 99% of the developers that are never going to touch that edge case, right?
Yeah, there's a computer languages researcher that I follow, Connor McBride. I'll send you the link, Seth.
Okay.
Connor McBride works on, so he worked on ML, as in meta language, in Scotland when it was first coming out. He's worked in type system and in type theory for a very long time. And he had a comment this morning, and I thought it was super interesting. And he said, type inference is so last century. The right thing to do right now is to write the types down, then get as much mechanical assistance generating the entirety of the programs as possible. So no longer basically moving towards types as specifications and then just letting something else mechanize the rest of it for you. Why do we care about literally, why do we care about writing programs? It's stupid. It's dumb. Yeah. It's fucking dumb. No, I'm serious. It's really, I just linked it to you. But we write these things and it's cool, but we write the same stuff over and over again when really we should be using like TLA plus, we should be using Idris or something to write down what we think the shape of the program is and then have something else like magic that up. And that's what Haskell is moving towards everything. So
yeah. I mean, it's almost, moving towards more of a markup rather than, what do we care underneath the hood, what it's actually doing, right?
I think most people
I get that,
right?
Yeah. Well, no, because I mean, the purpose of like the programs that we build is realistically like input, output, how it accomplishes that. As long as it's within like the time frame of what we want, why do we care, right? Well, I mean, outside of the fact that we couldn't be hipsters and we couldn't claim that we, write Go, that.
But do we really want to write Go? Like, I mean, really, I think the vast majority of programming is dumb. It's mostly like janitorial, like moving things around and processing, and it would be better mechanized for us. It'd be more secure and better. And this is my controversial opinion, I guess, here, but it's fucking stupid. Most programming is dumb. No, right? I mean,
okay. Yeah, no, I get it, right? Like that's, I would agree. Like, I have a tendency to agree, right? That we don't like, there's nothing new that we're really trying to accomplish. It's just, hey, we're, it's a new platform. It's whatever it is, right? Like, but I don't know. And this always goes back to the thought that, we have this fight about, or whatever that happened at lojikil that they were talking about. Hey, everybody that's in product security needs to know how to program. Like, yeah, right. Like, it's going to help your career if you can read languages, right? You're right. But guess what? What constitutes a program? Right? Like, what is it? Right? Anything that takes something, processes it, and spits it back out. So you can't look down on the guy that actually understands shell scripting, right? Because that's a programming language, right?
Well,
or
any user input can be modeled as a language, right?
Yeah, like ETL stuff. It's all, anything that a user can, provide, right?
Well, that's langsec, right? Is the thought that you need to move towards a linguistic theory of security, rather than an actual like instead of treating user input as I'm getting some JSON object or things like this. These are a series of domain specific languages that your program processes, right? I just linked you to the langsec proceedings because that's easiest.
Yeah, and that's what I popped up there too, right? Is a lot of the security vulnerabilities, the security issues that we have is a breakdown of that understanding, right? What?
Well, no, I was going to say, it's funny when infosec people get all hung up on like everyone needs to be able to program, because infosec code, in my experience, infosec code has been some of the shittiest, most vulnerable, horrible code that I have ever seen in my life. I mean, you and I have talked about this before as well. Like, you and I used to be janitors fixing other people's code. That's what you and I would commiserate about all the time.
Yep.
And it was hugely problematic, And it's funny because infosec is suddenly like everyone should program, and it's like they never said program well.
No, well, okay, and to be fair, right? Like I think James Wickett and Ken, those guys, they're talking about,
I know.
hey, being able to, yeah, just being able to understand what's going on. But no, you're absolutely right. We look at code that's coming out of the security industry, and it's like, oh my word, right? Like
Oh yeah.
these guys, like they would be junior programmers somewhere, and they wouldn't be allowed to touch production.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, they may not get a job, right?
No.
But they understand these small pieces really well. So great, you're specialized,
Right.
but it's yeah.
I'd rather kick that up a level and not even have most folks thinking about that sort of thing. I'd rather have business analysts. And I know this gets back to like the 80s when all of us were experimenting with things like Clipper and like specification languages, and that like we're going to have this one day where there's no programmers whatsoever. But we're actually able to do that sort of program synthesis now relatively performant wise. It's not like IBM Rational Rows anymore where you give it something and it generates like 10 million lines of code.
No. I mean, yeah. A lot of what business analysts are trying to do anyway, right, is I think that's partly why data analytics has become such a huge hot topic. Is they no longer need a computer scientist to go in and actually build them something. They can go into Elasticsearch, and they can pull the data out and manipulate it in some way. They can use R. And there's other mechanisms for them to manipulate data to actually understand, to get at the heart of the problem that they want, as opposed to, okay, I have to define a set of requirements, I have to codify all of this, and when I need to make changes or I need to run some other analysis, then all of a sudden I have to go through another like development cycle, and it becomes a huge like business problem. So yeah, like I mean, I get it, right? Like I feel like we have a tendency, or we're starting to abstract ourselves away from that, right? Like over time, that's what's happening. And yet there's still, there's all this security debt that's out there, right?
Oh, for sure.
That I don't think we're getting away from, right? And I know we're creating new security debt as well, because we have these new languages. Everybody hops on the Ruby bandwagon or the Go bandwagon. And maybe 90% of them don't really know what they're doing, and we end up with the same sorts of issues that we had. We end up with security issues that are specific to that language,
right? Or implementation of the framework, right? Like how many issues have been there with Gorilla and CSRF or whatever in Go? It's like every single time we hop on, it's cool. We have a new language, it expresses new things, but we also have the same security bullshit all over again. And for what reason? Like, I do think moving away from most people programming would be fine. I'm fine with that.
Well, there it is. You just need to set up security as a microservice, and
let's not get too far. I'm thinking TLA plus or COC or AGDA or something like that. I'm not thinking about like setting up anything microservice-y or anything like that. That's a little.
Come on.
I'm controversial. I'm not a jerk. But I mean, like, no, I love Ken. You know that I love Ken. I think he has a very good point with the current ecosystem about learning to code. But where we can move to, what we should be doing next, like. I think we can move away from these sorts of things, from requiring code and moving towards synthesis and understanding things, not just at a framework level, but at like a specification level.
Yeah.
Remember,
the more what?
Remember Cucumbers, like the BDD framework, Cukes?
Yeah, I do.
Like, remember, that would be much better to code. Like that sort of specification would be much better than like coding up all of the problematic things that people thought that the Cuke meant.
Yeah. No, it definitely would, right? Because it's easier to understand. I mean, you're getting back to that LangSec. It's easier for people to understand. They're getting out what they expect without having to, build the whole, code base behind the scenes. So I just don't know. I don't know how we get from where we're currently at to that ideal. right? And that was my big question to Manico as well, is like, great, you think that XSS is going to be solved, right? And then you turn around at locomocosec and you see, Google paid out 75% of their bug bounties to, for XSS. That's it, right? And like, Google's a huge engineering org. If anybody, is going to solve that problem and be able to figure out how to protect against it, it probably should be them. But, right. So obviously they haven't pushed that framework down. So like, how do we get there when we have all these disparate, languages, we have all these disparate frameworks? Everybody thinks they're the shiny and they're the exception. So they're going to go and they're going to break that framework in some way, or they're not going to, yeah. So how do we get there?
Well, it's like Microsoft. So you mentioned Google paid out majority of XSS vulnerabilities, but Microsoft paid, like, theirs was something like 70% memory corruption, like off by one vulnerabilities. Like, most of their stuff is still legacy C and C++. Like, oops, I accidentally overran a buffer.
Yeah.
Like, it's just, the fact that developers can still do for loops and accidentally overrun a buffer because they have no linguistic support for doing otherwise is, like compilers in F* will tell you, oh, hey, you're actually off by one before you even run the thing. So
yeah. Well, yeah. So it's, at that point, it's a developer education perspective, right? Like, hey, maybe we shouldn't be teaching .NET and Java in school, right? We should be teaching F*. We should be teaching these higher level languages, because that's going to be what the kids are going to, or like, that's what the new employees are going to come in and want to program. It's going to take a generation to actually get past that. But like what you're saying with Microsoft, we're a generation removed from coding real C, C++, and yet that's still the problem that they're dealing with. Like, do we ever really get away from that?
Well, there's the long tail of it, right? Like, C and C++ will be haunting us when you and I are both dead and in the ground, and it's been years and years. True. Because it's just there's so much infrastructure that's still written on it and will always be written on that. And people don't want to pay the money to model things. They don't want to understand what they're actually doing, right? They just want to hack shit together and be done with it. And there's something to be said for that, but there's also something to be said for, like, maybe if we sat down and thought about this for like 2 hours, we'd come up with a much better solution than just hacking it together and throwing it together, which is what coding does, right?
Yeah.
I'm not controversial at all.
No, you're not. Yeah. Yeah, I want to feel like we get like it gets better over time, and we introduce the concepts, and we train the developers, and we have seen some of that long tail stuff going on with specifically like injection vulnerabilities and stuff like that. Like, we understand how that works, so we kind of took away the option, and everybody uses parameterized queries, and you're using all these frameworks that's the only way to talk to the ORM. And that, we give them the option of using something that's insecure, but it's like outside the box, and, hey, like, that's not the standard way. And so, like, I think in my early career, like SQL injection and, ASP days and early PHP days, and it was every single application, like every single parameter that you would hit. Nowadays, if I find it's one parameter, somebody's doing something strange, it's in a weird place in the application, it's somebody else's code, right? And so it's definitely this like long tail of, yes, it still exists, but it's kind of it's an edge case now. It doesn't need to be number one in the OWASP top 10 because the risk has been reduced. So we are getting there. I think you're right, we're getting there, but it never seems to be quite fast enough. And, as we're moving to these new languages and we're recreating the wheel every 6 months or 2 years or whatever it is.
Yeah. I mean, we know how to fix it. It's just, again, as usual, we don't want to pay the money to actually do so,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Because it's going to take, the enterprises, from their perspective, if they want to get rid of all that old code, they're basically throwing away their business and starting from scratch.
Absolutely.
Right?
And it's hard, right? You'd have to, I mean, you can have specializers and you can have things that generate for the same platform that you're already on, but that's still a time investment. You have to make sure that's correct. There's proofs that you have to handle there. And it's a lot. It's a lot of code. But it would be a better and safer future for everyone. Right?
Sure. Okay, so just burn it all down. We'll start from scratch. That's what you're saying.
Pretty
That's
much.
the nihilist view today.
I'm Zarathustra coming down from the mountains with some embers and threatening to burn down the valley or something. Yes.
Yeah, yes. Okay, good. At least I've got my quote for the episode. That's all that we needed. We'll go from there.
But yeah, I mean, I think moving away from it, or testing moving away from pure Turing completeness to more restricted languages, more restricted frameworks, I think would be perfect for the future.
Yeah.
There's your quote.
Okay, sweet. Got it. Sweet. I'll tag it. We'll be good to go.
Tag it and tag it.
Tag it. Sweet, man. We've been going for over an hour, so as usual, it goes by quick. But this has been really interesting. I'd agree. The Huawei discussion stuff was, it is what it is. But on the programming language perspective, I just don't know. I'm just torn because I don't see how we get there quickly enough, right, to prevent half of what's going on. And there's always going to be new attacks. And so even though we solve one problem, it seems like, it's the Medusa, 4 or 5 new ones pop up. So are we making progress? Yes. Is it fast enough? No. But we can't really get there without the money and without the support. I almost feel like it's not until government and compliance comes into it that we actually do anything.
That's going to be terrible, though.
Yeah. I know it is. Yeah.
Like the CISA, right? The new Department of Homeland Security agency that's come out. If they actually ever come down hard on people, it's going to be hugely problematic.
Yeah.
Because they're going to come down with a giant sledgehammer of death. They're not going to come down with a very nuanced approach, right?
True. Well, and but that's the only way that stuff gets done. So
absolutely.
Cool. All right, man. Cool. Well, appreciate it. Thanks for listening if you're there. And we'll go ahead and post all this here shortly. But yeah, Stefan, as always, it's fun. We'll do it again sometime. And maybe I'll have Ken host you, and he can just sit there and Google the whole time. So. All right. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. Thanks, everyone.